Russia versus Ukraine, what the media doesn't show. When people hear Russia versus Ukraine, they often imagine explosions, tanks, and dramatic battlefield headlines. But behind the breaking news and flashy sound bites lies a far deeper, more complicated story, one that stretches back centuries, shaped by politics, culture, economics, and identity. This is not simply a war that began in 2022. It is a conflict with roots in the Soviet Union, Cold War rivalries, NATO expansion, and centuries of intertwined history between two nations that were once called brothers. Today, we'll explore what the media doesn't show. The forgotten voices, the silent suffering, the untold history, and the hidden battles, not only with weapons but with propaganda, economics, and global power struggles. Long before modern news cameras rolled into Kyiv or Donetsk, Ukraine and Russia shared centuries of history. The story begins with the medieval state known as Kievan Rus, 9th to 13th century, centered in Kyiv. This was the cradle of Slavic culture and Orthodox Christianity. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians all trace parts of their identity to this ancient kingdom. But after Mongol invasions, the story diverged. Ukraine fell under the influence of Poland and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia grew under the Tsardom of Moscow and later became an empire of its own. These different paths led to cultural differences. Western Ukraine absorbed European influences, Catholicism, and more democratic traditions. Eastern Ukraine remained closer to Russian Orthodoxy and Slavic traditions. This cultural divide would later become a political fault line. One side looking west toward Europe, the other side looking east toward Moscow. What the media doesn't show, the seeds of today's war were planted centuries ago in these diverging identities. What looks like Russian aggression or Ukrainian resistance today cannot be understood without this long historical lens. When the Soviet Union was formed in 1922, Ukraine was absorbed as one of its republics. But life under the USSR was far from equal. The Holodomor, 1932-1933, one of the darkest chapters in Ukrainian history, and one the media rarely highlights deeply, is the Holodomor, the man-made famine under Joseph Stalin. Millions of Ukrainians starved as Moscow enforced brutal grain requisition quotas. To this day, Ukrainians remember the Holodomor as an attempt to crush their independence. Russia, however, disputes the interpretation that it was targeted genocide. The memory of this famine created a deep scar in Ukrainian society, a wound that still influences distrust toward Moscow. World War II and aftermath. During World War II, Ukraine became one of the bloodiest battlefields. Millions died under Nazi and Soviet occupations. Some Ukrainians collaborated with the Nazis, not out of ideology, but out of hatred for Stalin. Others fought bravely for the Soviet Red Army. This dual history remains controversial. In the West, some hail Ukrainian nationalist fighters as heroes. In Russia, they're painted as fascists. The Soviet years, 1945 to 1991, post-war Ukraine industrialized under Moscow's control. Eastern Ukraine became a hub of heavy industry, reliant on Russian trade. Meanwhile, Western Ukraine continued to feel culturally closer to Poland and Europe. What the media doesn't show, while the USSR projected unity, resentment quietly brewed. Many Ukrainians saw themselves as colonized. Yet at the same time, millions of Russians and Ukrainians intermarried, studied together, and worked in the same factories. Families were mixed. Identities overlapped. This is why today's war feels, for many ordinary people, like a civil war within a family. The Soviet Union collapses. Ukraine votes for independence with over 90% in favor. Even Crimea, a region with a Russian majority, votes yes. At that moment, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, more warheads than China, France, and the UK combined. But in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum in exchange for guarantees of sovereignty from Russia, the US, and the UK. Many Ukrainians today look back at that decision as a tragic mistake. Without nukes, they were vulnerable. And when Russia later annexed Crimea in 2014, the promises of protection felt empty. What the media doesn't show, the Budapest Memorandum is rarely discussed in detail on TV. But it's a key to understanding Ukrainian anger, the feeling that the world betrayed them. After independence, Ukraine faced chaos. Corruption spread through politics. Oligarchs, wealthy businessmen, took control of industries. Ordinary people struggled with poverty. Meanwhile, Russia under Vladimir Putin sought to rebuild its sphere of influence. To Moscow, Ukraine was not just another neighbor. It was the heart of the Slavic world, a buffer against NATO, and home to the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. As Ukraine wavered between pro-Russian and pro-European leaders, its politics became a tug of war. In the east, loyalty to Russia. In the west, dreams of joining Europe. What the media doesn't show. The real battle was not only about territory, but about identity. Who are Ukrainians? A people tied forever to Russia? Or a sovereign nation aligned with Europe? Ukraine's presidential election is rigged in favor of the pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. Mass protests erupt in Kiev's Independence Square, the Orange Revolution. People camp out for weeks. Western media covers the protests as a victory for democracy. Russian media paints them as a Western-backed coup. Eventually, the election is rerun and the pro-European candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, wins. But the story doesn't end. Ukraine remains split. Corruption continues. And Moscow feels increasingly cornered. What the media doesn't show, these color revolutions across former Soviet states, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, terrified Moscow. To Putin, they looked like CIA operations aimed at overthrowing governments friendly to Russia. This fear would fuel Russia's actions later in Crimea and Donbass. When most people hear about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the conversation usually focuses on battlefield updates, sanctions, and diplomatic meetings. But behind this war lies one of the most important and often unspoken factors: NATO expansion. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker famously told Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would expand not 1 inch eastward. This was part of a reassurance meant to calm Moscow's fears as Germany reunified and the Cold War came to an end. Yet over the next 3 decades, NATO did the exact opposite. It expanded from 16 members to 30, incorporating almost every Eastern European country that had once been in Moscow's orbit: Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and more. To Russia, this wasn't just broken promises, it was a strategic threat. Imagine for a moment, what if Russia formed a military alliance with Mexico and Canada and placed missiles near U.S. borders? Washington would see it as a red line. This is exactly how Moscow views NATO's growth. Ukraine's potential membership was seen by Russia as the final straw. For years, Ukraine was pressured between East and West. Western leaders claimed NATO was defensive only, but leaked cables, like the famous 2008 WikiLeaks cable from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, revealed that even U.S. diplomats knew Ukraine joining NATO was a red line for Russia. Still, Western politicians publicly downplayed this. Media outlets framed it as Ukraine's free choice, but rarely discussed how Moscow had been warning about this for years. This silence is what the media doesn't show. The roots of the war were not simply about democracy versus dictatorship. It was about decades of broken security promises. Wars are not just fought with tanks and missiles, they're fought with information. From the beginning, both Russia and Ukraine understood that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the battlefield. In Russia, state TV framed the conflict as a special military operation to protect Russian-speaking minorities and to denazify Ukraine. In Ukraine, President Zelensky used social media masterfully, presenting himself as a modern-day Churchill standing against tyranny. His speeches were broadcast in parliaments around the world, making Ukraine a symbol of freedom. Meanwhile, Western media heavily amplified Ukrainian voices, often ignoring Russian perspectives. Stories about Russian losses spread quickly, while Ukrainian casualties or corruption scandals were rarely front-page news. For example, reports of Azov Battalion's neo-Nazi ties existed for years, but after 2022, Western outlets began downplaying or rebranding them as nationalists. The bombing of Mariupol's theater, allegedly by Russian forces, dominated headlines, but later investigations showed inconsistencies in the narrative. This doesn't mean one side is innocent. It means that propaganda is everywhere. Both sides manipulate facts to serve their cause, and mainstream media usually takes the side that aligns with their government's interest. What the media doesn't show is that truth is often the first casualty of war. While missiles were flying in Ukraine, another war was raging quietly across the globe: the economic war. Western nations unleashed unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Banks were cut off from SWIFT, Russian oligarchs had yachts seized, and Western companies pulled out of Moscow. The ruble was expected to collapse. But something unexpected happened. Russia adapted. It turned to China, India, and Iran for trade. It demanded that gas exports to Europe be paid in rubles, strengthening its currency. It redirected oil sales to Asia at discounted prices, and countries lined up to buy. Meanwhile, Europe faced its own crisis. Gas prices skyrocketed. Factories slowed production. Ordinary citizens paid record-high energy bills in 2022 and 2023. Here's what the media didn't emphasize. Sanctions hurt Europe almost as much as Russia. Germany, once the powerhouse of Europe, entered recession. Farmers across the continent protested rising fuel costs. This was not just a battlefield war, it was a war of economies, reshaping global alliances. Mainstream headlines focus on leaders, soldiers, and strategies, but the real suffering falls on civilians. In Donetsk and Luhansk, families have lived under shelling since 2014. For years, Western media barely covered their deaths, even though thousands were killed. In Kharkiv and Mariupol, children grew up in basements using candles for light. In Russia, ordinary citizens faced censorship, military drafts, and economic hardship. Mothers protested conscriptions, but their stories rarely made it into Western papers. Perhaps the biggest silence lies in the refugee crisis. Millions fled Ukraine, into Poland, Germany, and beyond. But few know that hundreds of thousands fled into Russia as well. Those voices are rarely heard in Western outlets. What the media doesn't show is that wars are not black and white. Civilians on both sides, Ukrainian and Russian, pay the highest price. When you strip away the headlines, the war in Ukraine is not just Russia versus Ukraine. It is a proxy war between global powers. The US has poured over $100 billion in aid and weapons into Ukraine. Britain, Poland, and other NATO countries followed. Meanwhile, Russia receives drones from Iran and deepens trade with China. This isn't just about territory, it's about the world order. The US wants to maintain global dominance. Russia wants to restore its sphere of influence. China quietly benefits, watching its rivals weaken each other. The media frames it as a noble fight for democracy, but in reality, Ukraine has become the battlefield for a much larger struggle, the fight for the future balance of power. 1. The humanitarian crisis. Beyond headlines. Mainstream outlets often highlight casualty numbers, refugee statistics, and destruction totals. But behind those figures are individual lives, torn apart in ways that numbers can never truly capture. A grandmother leaving her ancestral home with nothing but a single bag. A father carrying his child across a destroyed bridge under shell fire. A young soldier writing farewell letters before heading to the front line. The media reports millions displaced, but doesn't always show what that displacement feels like. Imagine losing not just your house, but your community, your identity, and your sense of belonging. Refugees aren't just moving from point A to point B, They're carrying invisible wounds, memories, and the trauma of leaving loved ones behind. 2. Hidden suffering. The forgotten groups. While much coverage focuses on military clashes and political leaders, several groups suffer in silence. Children. Many have lost years of education. Schools destroyed. Lessons interrupted. Some grow up in bunkers, knowing only the sound of air raid sirens. Elderly. Too frail to flee, many are trapped in war zones, relying on neighbors or volunteers for food. Their stories rarely make global TV. Disabled individuals. Evacuations are often impossible without specialized equipment. The world hardly sees how the most vulnerable are left behind. Prisoners of war, POWs. Each side claims humane treatment, but both have been accused of abuses. Few independent journalists can verify what truly happens in captivity. 3. Psychological warfare on civilians. Modern conflict is not only fought with missiles and tanks, it's also fought in the minds of ordinary people. Civilians face constant fear. Air raid sirens at night leave people sleepless. PTSD skyrockets, but mental health services collapse. Misinformation. Both Russia and Ukraine spread narratives about who is winning or failing. Civilians live in a fog of uncertainty, never knowing whom to trust. Economic collapse, jobs vanish. Currencies fluctuate. People sell family heirlooms just to buy bread. But this suffering is rarely given the airtime it deserves. 4. The black market ANAMP. Survival economy. Another hidden dimension is the survival networks. In war, black markets thrive. Food ANAMP, medicine. Scarcity leads to price gouging. Some families spend a week's wages on a single pack of insulin. Fuel ANAMP, energy. Smuggling becomes a lifeline, especially in blockaded areas. Weapons. Both sides deny it, but arms sometimes end up in civilian hands. Desperate populations turn to illegal markets when official supplies vanish. The media doesn't dig deep into these hidden economies because it complicates the good versus evil narrative. But for locals, survival depends on them. 5. Cultural identity at risk. Wars don't only kill people, they erase cultures. Libraries, churches, mosques, and monuments are destroyed. Languages become weapons. In Russian-controlled areas, Ukrainian is suppressed. In Ukrainian areas, Russian is sometimes stigmatized. Generations may grow up detached from their roots. The long-term loss is not just about buildings, but about memory, identity, and heritage. 6. Media blind spots. Why don't we see this side? Sensationalism sells. Explosions, tanks, and military victories attract more viewers than stories of quiet suffering. Political pressure. Both Western and Russian outlets shape coverage to align with their government's interests. Access restrictions. Journalists cannot always reach devastated villages, POW camps, or underground hospitals. As a result, audiences around the world rarely see the silent war, the war fought in kitchens, hospitals, and shelters. 1. The hidden humanitarian crisis. While mainstream outlets focus on front lines and military strategies, there's an invisible war happening in kitchens, hospitals, and shelters. Food insecurity. In rural Ukraine, farmers struggle to harvest crops because of unexploded ordnance and constant shelling. Russia, too, feels shortages, with sanctions making some supplies scarce. Medical collapse. Ukrainian hospitals near the front lines face electricity outages, lack of staff, and broken supply chains. Ordinary Russians in small towns, meanwhile, find life-saving medicines harder to import due to sanctions. Displaced families. Over 6 million Ukrainians fled abroad, while millions more are displaced internally. But the media rarely shows what happens after. Integration struggles, discrimination abroad, and trauma that follows them daily. 2. Propaganda on both sides. Both Russia and Ukraine run sophisticated propaganda campaigns, but viewers usually only see one version depending on where they live. Russia's narrative, The Kremlin portrays the war as a defensive special military operation, claiming to protect Russian speakers and fight Western expansion. Ukraine's narrative. Kyiv presents itself as the last line of defense for democracy against authoritarian aggression. The missing nuance. Independent journalists who try to show both sides are often silenced, arrested in Russia, or accused of disloyalty in Ukraine. 3. Economic wars. Nobody talks about sanctions dominate headlines, but their real impact on ordinary people is less discussed. In Russia, prices for everyday items, from smartphones to baby formula, skyrocketed. Wealthy elites adapt, but the middle class shrinks. In Ukraine, foreign aid helps, but corruption scandals surrounding billions in reconstruction funds often gown reported internationally. Meanwhile, Western corporations quietly profit from energy fluctuations, weapons sales, and grain deals. 4. Soldiers' untold stories. Behind every battle update lies a human being. Russian conscripts. Many are teenagers from poor rural areas, sent to the front with minimal training. Their mothers often protest silently but face jail time. Ukrainian defenders, while hailed as heroes, many suffer PTSD, alcohol dependency, and lack of proper medical care. Some return to destroyed homes, unsure why they are still fighting. Deserters. Both armies have soldiers trying to escape the war, but their stories rarely see the light of day. 5. The role of outsiders. Another hidden layer of the war is the role of foreign fighters, mercenaries, and intelligence agencies. Wagner Group and AMP, other contractors, mercenaries play a huge role in Russian operations, often committing atrocities outside official chains of command. Western volunteers. Fighters from the US, UK, and Poland join Ukraine, sometimes for idealism, other times for pay. CIA, NAMP, NATO involvement. While governments deny direct fighting, leaked documents suggest training, equipment, and intelligence flows steadily to Kyiv. 6. The media's selective silence. Why don't you hear about these things? Because narratives sell better than truth. Graphic images of destroyed tanks bring more clicks than interviews with a displaced grandmother. Military wins make better headlines than stories of corruption in aid funds. Journalists who attempt deeper investigations often lose funding or access. Behind every headline, every military statistic, and every political speech lies the silent story of ordinary people. In this part, we shift away from battle maps and diplomatic tables to the real human cost of war. This is the part the media rarely shows, the lives in ruins, the silent suffering, and the stories that resist fitting neatly into the us versus them narrative. Millions of Ukrainians have fled their homes since 2022. Poland, Germany, and other EU states absorbed large populations, creating both humanitarian solidarity and social strain. But what isn't shown? Many refugees who don't fit the perfect victim stereotype struggle with finding work, housing, and even being accepted. Ukrainian Roma minorities, for example, have faced discrimination even within refugee camps. Meanwhile, inside Russia, families of soldiers killed in combat receive state compensation, but often silence themselves in fear of speaking publicly. Quote from a refugee: "We left with just 2 bags. They told us we'd be safe. But now every day we're told we are a burden." Russian civilians have also faced enormous pressures, yet their voices are rarely amplified internationally. Economic sanctions, job losses, and the draft have altered daily life. Mothers of soldiers, echoing the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers movement from the Chechen Wars, have spoken out, but face arrest or intimidation. Ordinary Russians are often framed in Western media as complicit aggressors, but the truth is more complicated. Many quietly oppose the war, but public dissent is dangerous. Narration. It is easy to point fingers at nations. It is harder to see the individuals caught in between, Russians who never fired a shot but who suffer consequences all the same. Children are the silent victims. Ukraine reports thousands of children displaced, traumatized, or separated from parents. Russia has been accused of forcibly relocating Ukrainian children into Russian territory, re-educating them into pro-Russian narratives. Meanwhile, Russian children in border towns near Belgorod have grown up with shelling and fear, yet their trauma is rarely discussed in Western coverage. UNICEF estimates long-term psychological harm for both sides, but little is said about how entire generations may carry scars for decades. Quote, "Children don't care about borders. They just want their parents back, their homes, their toys, their schools." The media often paints a one-sided picture of heroes and villains, but the grim truth is that atrocities happen across the battlefield. Reports of torture, executions, and mistreatment of POWs exist from both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Civilians in occupied territories face impossible choices: collaborate and be branded traitors, or resist and risk execution. These stories often go unreported because they complicate the clean morality tale of war. Narration. The truth is messier than any side admits. In war, morality is often the first casualty. Independent journalists risk their lives to uncover the realities hidden from mainstream reporting. But many stories vanish, either censored by state media in Russia or overshadowed in the West by stories that align with political goals. Farmers who lost everything. Teachers who kept classes running underground. Soldiers who defected but disappeared into silence. These voices remind us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also erased by the powerful. Closing narration. Behind every statistic there is a face. Behind every map there is a home. The war between Russia and Ukraine is not just a geopolitical chess match. It is a tragedy lived by millions whose names we may never know.